Proposition 117 is another interesting layer that passed last year at the ballot, which required a vote of the people on new fees as well. So it added a protection, or was meant to protect against and require that similar vote against on fees that we have on taxes. However, it had a revenue limit. Tax only required a vote of new fees above $100 million over the first 5 years. And so each of these fees, there's six new enterprises set up, and each of these new fees going to these enterprises falls under the Proposition 117 cap.
Let me take a shot at this, which is Prop 117 said if you're going to have a big fee, you're going to have to ask the people. And it passed. These people, these legislators are so arrogant that since if its level is here in order to pass a fee, anything over, they just cut this into 4 little parts, and each one goes under that limit. It is the most devious, disgusting way to get around consent of the governed that I've ever seen down there. It's ugly, and it's costly. So as you might know, our governor wants the income tax to be zero, which is amazing because that's what we've been pushing at the Independence Institute for almost 35 years now. So glad to see him come along. I just have the stupid question. If he wants lower taxes, why is he increasing taxes so much? Chris Brown from the Common Sense Institute spent some time looking at all these wonderful tax increases, which none of us got to vote for. All right, first of all, CSI has been doing incredible work lately, so thank you for pumping all this out. In the last session alone, how much did state government raise taxes? Or should I just say revenues?
Nearly $700 million in new taxes and fees were increased during the 2021 legislative session, which...
Stop right there.
That's
because
enough.
I know we have the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. I remember working on Tabor. I remember pushing Tabor. And Tabor said, we get to vote on those revenue increases, those tax increases. So how in the world did they, without a vote, raise our taxes $700 million a year? You are a liar.
Well, you may call me a liar, but I'm not a lawyer. So I couldn't tell you the difference between, the courts have sorted out a difference between a fee and a tax. And so fees, although actually, interestingly, this legislative session, some technically taxes were raised as well through eliminating certain deductions. Right. So taxes were included in that number, are included in that number. But I guess another layer to that, maybe listeners are familiar with Tabor. We've talked a lot about Tabor and understanding that issue. Proposition 117 is another interesting layer that passed last year at the ballot, which required a vote of the people on new fees as well. So it added a protection, or was meant to protect against and require that similar vote against on fees that we have on taxes. However, it had a revenue limit. Tax only required a vote of new fees above $100 million over the first 5 years. And so each of these fees, there's six new enterprises set up, and each of these new fees going to these enterprises falls under the Proposition 117 cap.
Let me take a shot at this, which is originally when Tabor was passed, it said fees are not part of Tabor. You don't have to ask to raise that. And that was because we heard from library districts that, we're going to go to the people if we want to raise the late book fee by a penny a day? That's ridiculous. Now fees have been used to give us the faster tax increase, the hospital bed tax increase, the mill levy increase, and now this. And these are massive fees. Prop 117 said if you're going to have a big fee, you're going to have to ask the people. And it passed. These people, these legislators are so arrogant that since if its level is here in order to pass a fee, anything over, they just cut this into 4 little parts, and each one goes under that limit. It is the most devious, disgusting way to get around consent of the governed that I've ever seen down there. It's ugly, and it's costly.
We started to look at this issue at the start of the legislative session. We issued a report that said going into the 2021 session, the state faces about $2.1 billion in new taxes and fees prior to the start of the session. Now, coming out of the session, as you said, we have new taxes and fees of about $700 million. There was temporary tax reductions in property taxes and a couple other income tax reductions on the earned income tax credit, funding the child care tax credit. So the net effect was slightly lower. But coming out of the 2021 session, we now face nearly $2.2 billion in new taxes and fees. So the trend that we face is concerning.
You used two different numbers. I heard 700 and then I heard 2.2. What's the difference? One is yearly. What's the 2.2?
No, it'll be an annual number, but that will include the pending taxes and fees that we know are coming from previous legislative sessions as well. And I want to be clear on this point. That also includes the voter-approved paid family leave taxes, about $1.3 billion in new fees, out of, you got me. You started this off.
Because my wallet can tell the difference between a tax and a fee.
Yeah, well, and so we have, pending fees and taxes coming from even before the previous session, and that number only grew. And so, again, we as an organization often study individual issues. Really, our mission has been to study and analyze specific policy issues for the purpose of helping inform the debate. What we found, and really as we saw these issues grow and really accumulate, is that we had to take a step back and put these numbers in broader perspective and look across the entire scope of what's changing at the state level and the local level to some extent. So, these numbers are really incredible. Now, I guess maybe another number for you. You started the conversation, I think, referencing, a sentiment that many probably have about increasing the competitiveness of Colorado, lowering the income tax rate. Another fun fact, but if you were to increase the state's income tax to pay for all fees, the total state income tax would be over 21%. So we currently have a rate of 4.55%. If you were to pay for, again, all fees through the income tax alone, we'd have to have a 17.2% percentage point increase in our state income tax.
Let me see if I'm following you here. Because I led the effort to reduce our income tax to where it is now, last session.
Yeah.
We've got something out on the streets right now, a petition, to see if we can get that down from 4.55 to 4.4. But you're telling me if you added up the faster fee and the hospital provider fee and the mill levy freeze and now the transportation fee, which has nothing to do with transportation, or very little, I should say, plus all the other little fees, that if we got rid of all those, which have now, which put them off book, if we put them back into the general fund and had to raise taxes to cover them, in other words, if we were honest about it, we'd have to raise our income tax to what level?
Yeah, over 21%. That also includes tuition and fees at higher education. But again, these were, at the time Tabor was passed in the early 90s, we had, I think the number is about $800 million roughly in fees at that time. We now have nearly $21 billion. That will grow to more than $23 billion in the next couple of years. So it will be more than two-thirds of our state spending will be exempt from Tabor in the form of federal spending and fees. So it's just another way of understanding and putting some perspective on the growth in spending, the growth in priorities, and so that Coloradans can understand.
The way I put it is
how it was changing.
Like this, that Colorado state government's like a big old whiskey barrel, because I like whiskey. And tax revenue goes in, and the barrel is the Tabor limit. You can't spend any more. So as that barrel fills up with taxes and other revenues, it goes up, and whatever spills over are refunds, and we get those back. But what the legislature has figured out is that they've put a spigot on the bottom of this barrel called fees, and they put it into a different bucket or a different barrel. And so every time it looks like we're going to get our refunds, they open up the fee spigot and call it the hospital provider fee, the faster fee, the mill levy freeze fee, now the transportation fee. When we started Tabor, that secondary bucket, that secondary barrel, was about a third of the size of the general fund. Now this barrel is larger than the general fund, almost by two-thirds.
2 times.
Yeah, it's insane. So you can talk about it from a fiscal point of view. Let me drop this thought. There is a democracy issue here, because now 2/3 of our budget is not being run by elected officials. There is no representation. All those other fees are being run by people who are appointed by the governor or other governing bodies. So the majority of our state is being governed and money is being spent by people we don't elect. This is a danger to democracy.
Yeah, I guess for me, on top of that, it's really a transparency question, I think, as well, and an accountability question. Yeah. I think to the extent, Coloradans want certain services. They view, they have different perspectives on what they want out of our state's government. They should understand the extent to which we are spending currently. And I think as a starting point, it's important to have that basic knowledge and understanding, and not a perspective that says, well, our general fund is reaching a Tabor cap, and we're going to see refunds, which hasn't occurred in well, I guess we'll be facing refunds now in the forecast coming out again next week, very likely. But the storyline and a lot of the conversation is the Tabor cap is restricting revenue growth and is restricting the ability for our state to invest and retain the revenue in our current tax system. And when you look at the fees and the growth in fees, and when you look at changes in tax code and tax policy that's occurred legislatively or by voters, you get a different picture. You get a more complete picture. As you said, the fee-based revenue is again roughly more than 2 times the size of our state's general fund, and the revenue that's subject to the Tabor limitations. So
I'll go one further on this, which is we keep hearing that government is starved for money, and it's a wash in money, just absolutely a wash in money, an obscene amount. Add to that most of the government in this state doesn't take place on the state level. It happens on the local level. Colorado has 5,000 local governments. Most of those, particularly the cities, have been what's known as debruced. They get to keep all their excess revenue. And so all the growth in government not only happens it happens on this lower level as well. And so a lot of other states, government comes from the state, and that's big. Go to the East Coast, state government is bigger than the local governments. Here we kept government closer to us. So we have cities and counties and school districts and library districts and special districts and water districts and cemetery districts. It's incredible. And those now are doing the same sort of stuff using fees to increase their take. And again, my wallet doesn't know the difference between a local tax and a state tax, a local fee and a state fee. All I know is there's a lot less money in my wallet. And I think people can just look at their property taxes and see that Tabor, which was supposed to keep that property tax at the same level, adjusted for inflation and population only, we've lost most of that.
Yeah, at the local level, property taxes, as you said, is the main source of funding, and most or many counties, taxing districts have changed those rules in some way. And with the passage of the reforms to the Gallagher Amendment, or the formula that governs previously governed our property tax system, our property taxes now will grow at the rate of our property asset. as opposed to some formula that can moderate that. And anyone that's picked up a newspaper in the last few months has seen the impact we've seen across home prices and residential home values, and that will directly translate now to property tax revenue.
So we're talking about the Gallagher change, and it gets really easy to get confused when we start talking Gallagher.
Yeah.
But since Gallagher has been, eliminated, probably the right term, think of it this way. Before, with Tabor, your property value might double because property values double, but your tax should stay the same because your government that's taking it was limited to what they had before. So they would have to cut your taxes in half so that you pay the same amount. Now, when your property doubles in value, your property tax will double in value. Now, I haven't realized that profit. It sure feels good that my property is now worth twice as much, but I still have to pay the taxes. I'm still living there. I haven't realized those. Maybe when I die, my kids will get the property. But now I'm paying more in taxes. You can see why in California, Howard Jarvis did his Prop 13. I'm trying to remember what it was, because particularly older people, they pay off their home and their tax bill became larger than what their home payment was.
Yeah. No, I mean, you said it spot on. I mean, property is an asset. It's not an income stream for residential homeowners, most residential homeowners. And so if you're paying tax on something that's accumulating and you're not seeing any direct benefit from an income stream, that puts a squeeze. Interesting to go back on one thing you mentioned in the last comment about the extent to which government has significant amount of funds. We're seeing tremendous growth both in fees and on the revenue side. I think it's important to also understand the moment that we're in from a fiscal standpoint as well. We're talking about however many months, 18 months into the pandemic, 15 months. I've lost track of that number, but it's. The state of Colorado has received over $65 billion or is committed over $65 billion in federal COVID relief aid. And that's across the entire economy. The state government has been given probably 10 to 11 billion of that number. But that's more than 15% of our state's GDP. Yeah.
65 billion. So the federal government just dropped 15% of the state's earning in one big blob out of made-up money.
Well, there's been 3 or 4 big blobs, right, and COVID relief and American Rescue Plan and HR 133. So, but yeah, over the course of 18 months, that's pretty quick succession, I think. But the important thing is that we're still behind from a standpoint of economic recovery. We have not returned to pre-pandemic employment levels. We're still facing, labor shortages. We're facing a lot of uncertainty. And the fiscal picture for the state is one where both state and local governments are continuing to make decisions and are unable to make certain decisions at the moment about where to spend that money because they just can't. It's just coming at them in such large amounts that there's a huge challenge. And
you mentioned the unemployment situation in Colorado. Colorado has always been a high employment state. We've always been in the top 3, sometimes top 5. And now we're in the bottom third. At one point we were down at the bottom 4. It was just incredible. These changes that are happening, not only are they affecting our property taxes, but they're going to affect employment. You mentioned the Family Leave Act.
Yeah.
This is a 1% payroll tax, and payroll taxes are paid by the employees. You might try to hide some of that by the employer paying for it, but that would be money that would have gone to the employee. So what's going to happen? If employment costs are going up, you're going to employ less people. We've already had regulatory changes like the war on oil and gas, so those industries are leaving. An attack on farmers and ranching in rural Colorado. For the first time since I grew up here, I think we could be facing systemic, long-term, sluggish, and poor unemployment in Colorado, a state that should never have this issue.
Yeah, well, I guess 2 points on that. One, we're talking about direct costs primarily here. We're sort of tallying up direct taxes, direct fees. I think in a lot of ways, that's almost the tip of the iceberg when you consider indirect costs of the new regulatory changes we've seen across the state. And so when you talk costs, you also have to think indirect costs. And those are harder to capture. Those are harder to add up, but ultimately will impact our state's competitiveness and the willingness of businesses to come to Colorado, to grow in Colorado. But the second issue that I'll add to your list that I think is important for all Coloradans to really understand is our unemployment insurance trust fund was depleted through the pandemic. We were one of 20 states, only 20 states to take on federal loans to continue to fund unemployment insurance benefits over the last several months. And that fund will have to be replenished to build up the reserve and pay off more than $1 billion in federal loans. And that is a pending more than $500 million tax on the back of rehiring the labor that was lost. So
you're telling me that out of the $65 billion that has come streaming in from Washington, again in made-up money because they just basically print it, or our grandkids will have to pay it off, they couldn't put an extra $1 billion in to take care of the unemployment insurance that we're now wiped out of?
Well, that's a great point. So technically the state can use the federal COVID relief funds for the purpose of replenishing the trust fund to some extent and paying out benefits as opposed to taking out any new loans. However, you just made a good point I think no one else has brought up in our research on that $65 billion number, is we didn't even tally in the loans to the federal. Those are in the relief packages.
Listen, Hairball, I am tired of doing your work for you.
Yeah, you just found another $1 billion that we didn't add in because we were only focused on the relief packages, and this is through a Treasury loan that we didn't even add in. So if you consider the loans that the trust fund has received, you found another $1 billion there, just right like on the spot.
Here's what you mentioned: the issue of transparency. You hit the nail on the head with it. I look at the hospital provider fee, for instance. It's a tax on when you're at your weakest, when you're in the hospital. And by law, when they passed it, they said the hospital cannot even put that on your bill. So you get your hospital bill, and it's this huge number, and you're angry at not the guys who put the hospital tax on without a vote of the people, but the hospital. So it's a way to hide the costs of their work. And all of what you've talked about really is about transparency, that people think that we're a low tax state. People think that we're actually, 49th in education funding. That's a lie. We're not. We're at about 26, 27. But it doesn't matter. These lies continue because you don't see the regulatory burdens, you don't see the fee burdens, you don't see all this stuff. And you're young, so you don't know this. There was a time, I tell you, that people on the political left were the ones who wanted transparency. They were the ones who fought for sunshine laws and open records laws to make sure those damn conservatives, we knew what they were up to. And now, those are the folks under that gold dome who are working day and night to keep the truth from being known of what people are actually spending.
It's a matter of, I think, prioritization and priorities. Our free enterprise system has to sustain our state's expenditures and our revenue, and it can't. And we have to understand what we are investing in and where we are spending our dollars. We put out a report called the Colorado Budget Then and Now, which looks at the state budget today, 10 years ago, and 20 years ago, to give, a broader perspective on how things have changed. And you mentioned education. We've seen education's share of our state budget shrink relative to other priorities. At the same time, say the transfers related to healthcare expenditures have skyrocketed, both in total spending, that's a lot of federal money, but also within our state's general fund, where education is the primary spending item.
I'll go one further.
It's transparency, and we want people to be aware of where these dollars are so they can be active in making the decisions of whether this is actually the priorities that they want their state spending money on.
If you look at the last 15 years or so, as every big line item in the state budget continues to increase, including education, not nearly as fast as healthcare, thanks to Obamacare, road spending, what they now just call transportation so they can put transit in there, has flatlined, absolutely flatlined. And it's one of those things that, well, you see the traffic jams and they create a problem. So therefore, the answer is either a tax increase, which the people several times over the last few years have voted down, or you do the new fees for, quote, transportation, mostly transit and feel-good stuff, and you create a crisis and then you charge again for it. This is the evil, and I use that word advisedly. That is the evil of how this works. The idea of the taxpayer bill of rights and a spending limit was, we, the voters, will tell you how much to spend. If you want more, all you have to do is ask. You can have as much as you want. You just have to convince us it's a good idea. You can go into debt as much as you like. You just have to convince us. So you get this pie, and then the legislature does the priorities. They refuse to do priorities because that means saying no to some people, and they don't want to do that. And so they keep increasing the budget with fees to make everyone happy, except people on the roads. All right, people want to read this stuff. It's really great stuff that you guys have done. Where do they go?
Yeah, please go to our website, commonsenseinstituteco.org. commonsenseinstituteco.org. That's right, yeah.
Which leads me to this other question. If you put CO at the end, does that mean there'll be an NE and an MA and a TX?
Or the URL was taken, one or the other. Yeah, I don't think, but no, we put all of our research out as a resource that we want people to engage in and share. Again, you can always go to our social media as well as a good place. We send out a newsletter every 2 weeks. So we want people to be able to understand these and debate these issues because, we have an election and a ballot cycle coming up here in just 2 months' time, roughly, where there will be a few more issues on the ballot, both statewide and within the city that directly relate to spending and fiscal issues. So, I think it's a never-ending process to learn these issues and, again, welcome the opportunity to share.
Hey, Chris, thanks for doing it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. My pleasure.
If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.